I am back this week on the QiRanger Podcast, North Korea, a week yen, and what exactly is defamation? Plus, we're heading to Tongyeong. This is the QiRanger Podcast, and it starts now. Greetings and salutations, my most excellent friends. I hope that you are off to an absolutely fantastic day. It is Sunday. Welcome to the QiRanger Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Miller, the internet's QiRanger, and you are listening to the QiRanger Podcast from QiRanger.com or on my YouTube channel or via iTunes. And thank you so much for downloading or taking part of your day to listen to the podcast, or sharing it with your friends, or actually downloading it and listening to it on your mobile device. Now, before we get into the meat of the podcast, I do want to make a quick little update announcement. Now, if you have been subscribed to the podcast for a while, you may have noticed a certain increase in the frequency of the downloads via iTunes or the RSS feed since the beginning of July. And the reason for that is that there are just so many interesting news stories that take place on a daily basis here in East Asia that I have taken the opportunity to make dedicated news posts on QiRanger.com about them. Now, since a large number of my university students use news sources, specifically English language news sources, to help with their listening comprehension, I've started the practice of making those news update blog posts as supplementary podcasts. So as breaking news takes place, if I have just an ordinary blog post, I will usually, if I have time, record the audio version of that and upload it here to the podcast feed so that those that have the opportunity to download various files on the fly can take a look at these breaking news items, listen to them, or if they are ESL teachers, download the actual MP3 file and use it in class to help with listening comprehension and to start some discussions about some of these regional issues. Now, these clips are usually 2 to 4 minutes in length, and they also have a link back to QiRanger.com, which has the source information. So be ready for a few more of those. I think in the past week there's been 2 or 3, and I actually really enjoy doing that. And if you have some information on whether or not you like seeing that much information in the podcast feed, please let me know. But that's the update for this week. I will be doing a few videos here and there during the month of August. I'm still on vacation. I'll be doing a few more videos in September, but I really won't. I guess August I return to the Korea blog, but in August and September I will be doing fewer videos. I still will be releasing videos, but I'll be mainly focusing on podcasts and blog, and then the fall season really kicks off in October. So that's all the updates I have for this week. Now it's time for the news. This week's news is just chocked full of interesting stories that I hope that you will enjoy. And as always, if you have any comments about them, please drop them in the comment section over on QiRanger.com, or if you're watching this podcast on YouTube, in the comment section down below. Now, the first story I want to talk about is really Korea and Japan related. Now, Japan has released once more its annual white paper, its defense analysis, and it claimed Dokdo, or Takeshima as it's referred to in Japan, as part of its territory. And immediately upon the release of that document, Seoul filed a formal complaint and summoned Japanese officials to local offices to tell them in purpose about their disagreement over the assertion that Japan has sovereignty over the islets in the East Sea, or the Sea of Japan. Now, this, of course, continues to be a thorn in the sides of normalizing relations between both nations. Now, recently on the vlog channel, I answered some questions from a Japanese individual about what I thought about the pair continuing to feud over these islets, and I basically said I consider the islets dokdo. I consider them part of Korean territory, not necessarily for historical significance, but because of the effective control Korea has over the islets, and that Japan really hasn't tried to forcefully assert control over them. They've acquiesced that control, and while they do Japan has made a claim and requested a hearing at the International Court of Justice. It's a voluntary process, and some individuals say, well, why doesn't Korea go to the ICJ to fight it? Well, Korea's standpoint is that why should we fight it? It's ours. We have people there. It's our territory. If someone would come up to an individual and say, I'm going to take you to court because I believe you're driving my car, when you know in fact it's absolutely your car, you wouldn't go to court to fight for your own car because you know it's your car. You are driving it. It's a ridiculous thing. So that's the way that many Koreans view the request to go to the ICJ, and that's pretty much what I believe the Korean government feels as well. They've, after all, have spent so much time and money trying to convince the world that this is an important issue and that it is, in fact, dokdo and not Tokushima. Now, what I would say is that everyone I've spoken to, on the Korean side, on the Japanese side, is just sick and tired of the whole issue. The controversy really plays out more and more between government-level officials and the ability to really irritate one another by these white papers and other statements. Most of the individuals I have spoken to, especially 20-somethings here in Korea, would just like the whole matter dropped. And I believe there are some individuals in Japan that have also said that it's time to move on. Probably one of the best ways to resolve this issue once and for all would be for Japan just to come out and say, all right, it's dokdo, it's your territory, and then to build relations between Korea and Japan, since there is such a vast amount of untapped natural resources beneath the ocean, to jointly develop them and continue on in some revenue sharing opportunity between the two nations. I think that would be a great olive branch. I think that would go a long way to actually resolve the issue and bring about better relations between the two nations. In other news, Korean politics, well, they are certainly interesting. A new report that came out actually on Thursday as I was preparing to record the podcast said that South Korea has one of the most corrupt governments. I shouldn't say governments. Has one of the most corrupt business and governmental statures, according to a survey of business individuals in South Korea and East Asia. But politics in general are pretty funny. Korea is home to the actual fisticuffs in the parliamentary arena. Now, all parliamentary activity came to a halt a while ago after a Democratic Party spokesman, Mr. Hong Il-pyo, referred to President Park Geun-hye as a gwite, or baby born to a ghost. Now, this word is best translated as the child of someone who should have never been born, and then the lawmaker who made a remark just started off a whole bunch of controversy, was ultimately asked to go before a closed-door meeting, apologize, and then was forced to step down from his party. But simply iterating this word, basically name-calling against the president, stopped Parliament for a few days. It was ridiculous that just a simple name-calling just halted government activity. Yes, it was stupid. Yes, it was idiotic. Yes, he needed to apologize. Lose his position? I don't know. I don't know the exact circumstances that he uttered the phrase, but still, I mean, it's very childish behavior, and I see a lot of childish behavior in a lot of politicians around the world. I just don't think that they are really in charge of their faculties all the time. Moving on to another story, no movement on the reopening of Kaesong Industrial Complex. Last week, some of the business operators were allowed to go back into the plant and retrieve some of their materials so that they could use them elsewhere, or if the products were finished, to retrieve them and sell them. But since then, both North and South Korea have had a number of talks. 4 to date. There's a 5th one planned, I believe, on the 22nd of July, but really no movement on actually reopening the plant. Now, personally, I think this is just a waste of time. North Korea really is just stringing South Korea along, stringing along the hopes of the remaining businesses that want to utilize the facilities, utilize the cheap labor there. It's time that South Korea just cuts and run. They're never going to have the assurances that they really need to have that the plant will be operated in a fair manner, that North Korea can never just come in unilaterally and close it off permanently. It's never going to happen. And even if they do reach such an agreement, the fact of the matter is the plant is in North Korea. There are no real safeguards on the South Korean side that would allow them to prevent North Korea from just closing it at the whim, that the wind blows, whatever it goes. So I think it's just time that South Korea needs to really realize that this is a failed endeavor and move on. North Korea, on the other hand, has made a request that China hired the 53,000 workers that have been furloughed ever since it closed the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Now, I don't think China is going to bite into that or take North Korea up on that offer. But it is interesting that North Korea even believes that the talks aren't going to go anywhere, and that should be a sign to South Korea to move on. If North Korea manages to find a home for the 53,000 workers, then why would it reopen Kaesong? If it did, that means South Korea would then have to train an additional 53,000 people to do the jobs that the other 53,000 were doing, which will delay the startup and resumption of normalized operation. It's just a bad move, and it's time for Kaesong to go away. Lawmakers on both sides of Korea's government are looking into allegations that former President Roh gave up the northern limit line in a conference with Kim Jong-il a while back. Now, this is a very controversial issue here in South Korea, and it really kind of makes the first time in my memory that both sides are really working together to get to the bottom of what was actually said during the meeting between President Roh and Kim Jong-il. Now, I will say that the Saenuri Party and the Democratic Party are on opposite sides of the spectrum as to the way they are currently interpreting events. But if you just read the snippets of information that have been released, a case could be made that President Roh wanted to redraw the northern limit line, the de facto border between North and South Korea, as it extends westward from the DMZ into the sea. And this is, quite frankly, a big issue because it's just really ripe with fishing and has been the source of a lot of maritime conflict. So whether or not Roh actually did or wanted to, at this point in the game, is a moot point. South Korea today acknowledges the northern limit line the way it was drawn and defends it as such. I don't know why they want to go back and just rehash this issue. It is just eating up too much time. Now, a very interesting story did come to light earlier about a school covering up a bullying incident. Now, the possible motive behind this cover-up was because the teacher that it was reported to didn't want a bad mark on the career portfolio. Now, since the story broke, the attacker has since apologized, and the father of the boy who committed the act also apologized and has been forced to pay out 5 million won in damages. Now, what happened was that at a school, you had a kid that was bullying around, and ultimately, this bully peed in the mouth of a younger student. And the younger student reported it. The family got behind it. They reported it, and they thought everything was taken care of, except when the incident was reported to the district office, certain events were omitted because the teacher wanted to possibly have that clean portfolio on his record. So an investigation took place, and all the events came out. Now, in my personal opinion, just performing a deep bow doesn't make things right. But that's me. I'm Western. I would want the kid expelled from school, transferred to a different school, has no business being in the same school as my child. The 5 million won are said to be presented towards the psychological treatment of the younger boy of having being force-fed to drink urine. So we'll see what happens. This is definitely a sign that there are significant instances of bullying in school and needs to be addressed categorically. The U.S. and Korea are going to hold cybersecurity talks, and boy, something needs to happen. South Korea continues to just be hacked left and right. Recently, South Korea has come out and listed North Korea as a suspect in the June 25th cyber attacks on Blue House and several other organizations, marking the second time this year that North Korea may have hacked into South Korean networks. And like I've mentioned before, a large problem is probably the outdated software that South Korea is using, making it really easy for hackers to get into various PCs, install Trojans and other malware that could effectively take down networks. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this conference. The United States is under a lot of scrutiny for its hacking endeavors around the world as well. Now, on the last part of the Korean news, the United States says it stands ready to cooperate with Panama should the Central American nation request assistance regarding a North Korean flagged ship it stopped while attempting to pass through the Panama Canal with suspected missile parts. Now, since then, Cuba has said that, yeah, it's just outdated missile technology, but North Korea is not supposed to have that kind of stuff. So it really shows that even through all this stuff, North Korea is not going to abandon its military first doctrine, is not going to abandon the way that it wants to propagate itself as a military state. And eventually this stuff is going to be confiscated. Now, the whole thing is kind of funny because the reason it's funny right now is because it rained in Panama and these missile parts were covered in cane sugar. So when it got wet, it got really sticky. So bees are now swarming the ship and making it difficult for others to open. Now, who knows what is actually going to happen? I will, of course, update you as I find out more, but North Korea has made tons and tons of money selling drugs, tons and tons of money selling weapons, and this is probably all part of the same scheme, part of the same routine. Now, in East Asian news, Japan's weaker yen is causing some Korea-related trouble for SM Entertainment. Now, SM Entertainment is one of the big music and entertainment conglomerates here in Korea that has enjoyed a lot of success in Japan. However, since Abe has taken government and implemented his Abe economics to revitalize the Japanese economy, the yen has continuously taken a dive in its value. So as people have a weaker yen, it makes it a little bit more difficult for those Japanese individuals to buy things from neighboring Asian countries because the Korean won is a little bit stronger now. I actually had some friends in Japan comment about the Abe economics, saying that as a whole, as they look back to their economic status in their home countries, they're expats. So while in Japan, they really haven't been affected by the lower yen, but if they send money back home, they're making possibly 25% less than they were a year ago. And that's a huge, huge amount of pay cut. I mean, just imagine having a job and realizing that you're losing 25% of your income due to the foreign exchange rate. I remember when I first came to Korea in 2008, the won just took a huge, huge dive. And towards the end of the year, so December 2008, I want to say that 1,000 yen was about 68 cents or so. And today, it's around 90 cents. So it's a huge difference. So imagine taking a 20 or 30% pay cut. And it's one reason why a lot of tourists are not leaving Japan to go visit elsewhere. Their spending money just doesn't go as far as it used to. Now, in some other news topics, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the Asiana Flight 214. That, of course, was a very tragic event where at least 3 individuals have perished. But what's interesting about this is the bickering that's going on between the NTSB and the Korean counterpart. Now, the Korean counterpart, the agency here that oversees flight operations, has sent a letter to the NTSB saying that they disagree with the way that the NTSB is handling the situation and objects to their frequent news conferences. Now, many times the Korean organization will have another conference following the NTSB a few hours later, and they will actually come to different conclusions. And they've actually said that once the pilots have been let go by the NTSB and returned to Korea, they're going to conduct their own separate set of interviews and their own separate investigation. So it's really sad that Korea is making that kind of statement towards the NTSB rather than really working closer with the NTSB on this matter. In my opinion, as I have viewed the events and viewed the data that has been released, I think ultimately it will be placed on pilot error. Now, it should be noted that it's going to take at least, most people are saying, about a year before the ultimate decision is going to come out. So don't want to jump to conclusions, but based on what has been released, I would say that probably, barring any kind of unknown mechanical failures that haven't been discovered yet, that the NTSB will probably find it as a case of pilot error. Now, when I say pilot, I don't mean the actual pilot that was flying the plane. I suspect the blame may be placed on the co-pilot. And the reason why I say that is that based on the excerpts of the flight recorder that I have seen, I don't see where the co-pilot was calling out airspeed and altitude on a fairly regular basis so that the pilot knew that he was flying too low and too slow, which is one of the fundamental jobs of the co-pilot during landing, to make sure you're calling out that information so that the pilot knows exactly where he is. So that may be what happens. Now, of course, there's the whole KTVU side of things with using the racially charged names. Asiana said, "Oh, we're going to sue you." And then it really blew up in their face, and they have since said, "No, we're not going to sue you. We're going to focus on the investigation and making our plane safe and having safe flights," which is what they need to do. But I also have to say that they got so much bad press from threatening to sue the the TV station, that they just didn't understand what exactly they were doing. Now, of course, George Zimmerman did have his day in court and was found not guilty of the 2 charges, second-degree murder and manslaughter. And a lot of people were upset with the verdict. Now, over on the BBC, they had an interview with a Yale law professor that kind of explained exactly what happened. And out of all the commentary I've seen on the Zimmerman verdict, I thought that was one of the best. Now, essentially, I think Zimmerman exercised extremely poor judgment. I think the fact that he got out of his little car and followed Martin and ultimately killed him played a huge role in that. But with the United States legal system, the defining aspect of it is that you must find someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's the threshold, and that's the kicker in all of this, is that you have to present, as a prosecutor, a case that is so airtight that there can be absolutely no doubt in a juror's mind that someone did not commit the act. And apparently, based on the verdict, the prosecution failed to achieve that goal. And that's the way the jury system worked. They didn't find him innocent, which is what a lot of people have said. They didn't find him innocent. They found him not guilty of the charges. And that's what people need to keep in mind. They didn't find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, many people have also said, and correctly so, that the civil lawsuit is going to come. I know it. It's going to be there. And the threshold for finding guilt is significantly lower. Just look at the O.J. Simpson trial. He was found not guilty of murder, but was found guilty of wrongful death. And that is where the verdict came. That's where the financial hit came, etc. And I think that's what's going to happen with Zimmerman. I don't think that he'll stand trial again. I don't think there'll be new evidence brought forward that will warrant a second trial. The prosecutors said that they believe they're going to appeal the case. But I do think that there will be a civil trial and that he'll probably be found guilty. And finally, in this week's news, could there finally be peace in Mindanao? Mindanao is, of course, the southern region of the Philippines that has been rocked with conflict for years and years. Now, the Filipino government has entered into a new wealth-sharing agreement for mineral and natural resources that hopefully will provide economic growth with the Philippines southern region and enable its tourism development as well. Now, there has been a lot of conflict, and in fact, during a recent clash, the United States issued a travel advisory to avoid not only the rural areas of Mindanao, but to exercise caution, even going to some of the major cities in Mindanao, such as Davao. So, will this bring about peace? I don't know. This has been the first really major breakthrough in a lot of peaceful negotiations. There hasn't been a lot of trust between the groups involved. Who knows? Only time will tell, and if everybody really adheres to both the letter and spirit of the agreement. As always, all the links to the stories are in the show notes, and you can check those out by visiting QiRanger.com. Now, if you want to keep up with other breaking news, please subscribe to QiRanger.com or visit the website on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to both my YouTube channels, the main QiRanger channel, and of course, the vlog channel. You can also follow me on Twitter and Facebook, where I share a lot of stories on a daily basis. But if there is something on your mind, please send me a question. You can do so at questions@QiRanger.com. Now coming up on Take Me Away, which originally aired on TBS EFM 101.3 in Seoul, South Korea, a little discussion about Tongyeong. Just take me away. Yes, Monday morning, the start of another work week, and I have to tell you, I am totally jazzed to be talking about one of my favorite places in all Korea. I say that time and time again, but Tongyeong, where we're talking about this week, is really one of my favorite places because not a lot of people go down there. And I especially like it because of its outdoor activities and because of its historical significance. Now, Tongyeong actually is, well, it's an older town, and it gets its name from its historical importance. If you're familiar with Gwanghwamun Plaza here in Seoul, you might see a large statue of Admiral Lee Sun-shin, and he is, of course, the famous naval commander that fought off the Japanese. But Tongyeong actually means command post, and this is one of his command posts and where his famous turtle ships were developed and deployed. And what really makes Tongyeong special is that in the harbor, they have a full-size reproduction of one of Admiral Lee's turtle ships. And I had the pleasure of going on one of these boats a few years ago, and it really, really made a huge impact on me. So I want to talk about that today before we dive into more about Tongyeong, because it's one of the more unique experiences that you can have in Korea. Because even if you go to, say, like the War Memorial Museum or some of the other museums around Korea, they have maybe a full-size replica of it, but typically on the inside of these boats, they aren't built to scale. They have a lot of dioramas. But the one in Tongyeong is actually real. It is seaworthy, and you can actually see how the people lived when they worked on this boat so long ago. So a little bit about these boats. Now, they were typically around 100 to 120 feet long, or 30 to 37 meters if you're using the metric system. And they were kind of built off and based off the Panokson. Now, this was a very traditional boat design back in the day, back in the Joseon era, that had very strong hulls, had two different sets of sails, and also had several oars coming out from the sides, meaning you could sail it in good wind conditions, but you could also really move the boat through human power with the oars. But Admiral Lee actually took it upon himself to redesign these boats, and he made it a covered structure. And the top of the boat actually has iron plates and iron spikes. And many historians believe that this is the first use of iron on boats, making the turtle ships the very first ironclad vessels in the world. Now, on the bow of the boat, you actually have a large dragon head. Now, this head served a few different purposes. Some say that they emitted sulfur during times to disguise where the boat was, to hide its movement. And also, it would breathe fire sometimes. But more importantly, you could actually take out those sets of equipment and put in a cannon and have a forward-facing cannon. Now, on the sides of the vessel, you had anywhere between 8 and 10 cannons that were retractable. So if you wanted to pull them back into the hull, you could actually do that as well and close the doors. But inside, there were actually two different levels. You had a store level, you had a working level, and then you had a command post level inside. And I have to tell you, even though I'm 6'4", 194 centimeters, walking around inside this vessel, I had plenty of room. However, you typically also had 50 or 60 fighting Marines on board, and sometimes up to 70 oarsmen in the boat with the captain. So you could be looking at almost 130 people maximum inside the different boats, and that would mean the cramped quarters would be really, really confining. And I don't know if I could really do that. But if you're looking to know more about Korea's naval history, going down to Tongyeong and checking out this boat right in the harbor is something you should do. Well, that's all the time I have today. I'll be back tomorrow with a little bit more to see and do in Tongyeong. It's a terrific Tuesday, and I have a very special activity for you today. Now, this particular hike isn't actually in Tongyeong. You have to actually take a ferry to the nearby island of Saryangdo. And once you're there, you are in for one of the most memorable experiences you can ever have. It is an incredibly beautiful hike. It can be challenging, but it is well worth it, because even though a lot of people now are finding out about this hike, it's not well traveled, meaning that if you've been to some of the hiking trails in some of the popular destinations around Korea, you know how crowded the trails can be. But this hike, the Jagged Ridge Trail, is not very crowded. And that is one of the reasons why I like it so much. So once you take the ferry over to Sarangdo, you have to make your way to the trailhead. Now, Sarangdo is a small island, and the actual trail itself is only about 6 kilometers long. And then where you get off the trail, you have to hike 1 more kilometer back to the ferry terminal. So it's 7 kilometers total. But to get to the trailhead, you need to find transportation there. Now, there are taxis and there are other ways to get out there if you don't have your own personal boat, or I shouldn't say boat, your car or scooter that you came over on the ferry with. So you can actually make your way out there, the trailhead. Everyone knows about the trailhead. And once you start hiking, that's when the fun begins. Because you start off at sea level, and then you start climbing. Almost as soon as you leave the area, you make your way through some rice paddies and some old farming areas, and then you start hitting the switchbacks back and forth, until you get all the way up to the first peak rather. And this peak is kind of where it gets the jagged ridge from, because the granite slabs that form the uplift are very pointed, and they're also striated, so they have a very sharp and almost like a razor look to them. And it's about 400 meters in height. And this is spectacular because as you're making your way up here, on both sides of you are beautiful views of the ocean. Now, from here, you actually hike along a ridge portion. And again, you have fantastic views on either side. But the second peak is also about 400 meters tall. But so you have to go down from the first peak just a little bit as you go along the trail. And as you make your way up to the second peak, you actually have to climb up there using ropes. Now, don't let that scare you. It's really not that frightening. It's actually probably around a 45-degree incline. So you could probably make it without the assistance of the ropes, but using the ropes certainly makes it a lot easier. And then from that peak, you can actually see a large portion of not only Sarangdo, but also the surrounding islands and the bay that's adjacent to. The rest of the hike is really easy. You have a few more ups and downs, but it's really, really nice. And it's probably one of the more picturesque hikes I've been on in Korea. And then at the very end of the hike, there are lots of different restaurants. And one of the best things to do at the end of a hike is, of course, sit down with a little pajeon and have a little drink to go with you. Now, I should make one thing perfectly clear on this hike. Is as you approach the tail end of the hiking portion on the mountain, you'll have a choice to go left or go right. And it's very important that you go right. You don't want to go left. The reason being is that that trail goes a little bit further, making your round trip to the start of the ferry dock a little bit longer. And since the last ferry leaves at 4 o'clock, it's really important to get there on time. So that's all the time I have today. I'll be back tomorrow with more. Yes, Wednesday, hump day. I gotta tell you, there are a lot of fun things to do down in Tongyeong, and they're all pretty much associated and in and around the marina area. So if you're looking for a weekend getaway, you can find a place to stay there. And of course, fill your days, your afternoons with just fun activities. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is not just isolated to the marina area. You can actually find people doing this all along the shorelines, all along the docks, pretty much everywhere, and that is sea angling. And if you're asking yourself, what is sea angling? That is just a fancy way of saying fishing. And I gotta tell you, I have never been one for fishing, but down here in Tongyeong, you really get that fun aspect of it because it's one of the more picturesque shorelines in all of Korea. The town has that just beautiful, beautiful ambiance. And getting some of these big fishing poles that are designed to cast lines way out into the harbor or way out into the ocean, and just sitting there with your friends, sitting there with your beverages, it is just a wonderful way to leisurely enjoy the environment. And I think it's probably one of my favorite pastimes to do if I'm just looking to, I guess, really enjoy nature and wanting to keep my body a little bit busy but not really overtaxing. So you can rent fishing equipment there and you can experience that kind of activity. But if you are more of an adrenaline junkie, they have a lot of things you can do as well in the marina area, such as renting personal watercraft like jet skis or what they like to call water motorcycles. And these are for anyone who is really over 60 centimeters in height. And you can go out on tours. You can rent them by yourself. You can go all over the bay. They just really ask that you are cognizant of others and mindful of others in the area, that you don't disrupt the fishermen, that you don't disrupt other people trying to go about on these personal watercrafts. It's also a lot of fun. But if you want a little bit more of a challenge, you can actually rent equipment and go windsurfing. And this is something that I have only tried once in my life before, and I have failed miserably at it. I have failed so many times at trying to stand up on the surfboard and hold the sail in place that I think I'm going to have to go down to Tongyeong this summer and give it another try, because this is something I really want to master, because there's just something about standing upright in a harbor on a surfboard with a sail and being able to cruise under your own power across the bay. So if you're looking to try this out, you can do this there. For something on a little bit more of a, roller coaster type experience, they have banana boat rides. Now, if you don't know what a banana boat is, think of a banana. It's big, it's yellow, and then picture yourself sitting on the banana being pulled along by a speedboat. And that is what a banana boat ride is. So in the harbor itself, around the marina area, you can actually go out on one of these banana boats, and you're outfitted with a life jacket. You're seated on one of these large yellow inner tubes that are shaped like a banana, and they pull you across the water at a very fast pace, and it's just a lot of fun. And a lot of times they'll try to do turns that will have you fighting against centripetal force and have you fling off into the water. It's a lot of fun. One of the things you can actually do in the area as well is do a little scuba diving, and there's a lot of different shops that will rent equipment to you, but you do need to be certified for that. So if you're planning to do some scuba diving, make sure you have your certification card with you. Well, that's all the information, all the time I have today for you. I'll be back tomorrow with a little bit more. Yes, Thursday. That means tomorrow's Friday and the weekend finally begins. So this week we have been talking about Tongyeong, and one of the things that makes this area so special is the variety of things that people can do. You can go boating, you can go hiking, you can just enjoy a leisurely day by the seashore. And if you're looking for, well, a little bit more of an adventurous activity, you can do what we're talking about today, and that is going for a hike on Miruksan, or Miruk Mountain. Now, if you've heard the name Miruksan before, that's probably because there are several mountains in Korea with the same name. And that is because that has a very special meeting. And it's the place where one of the Buddhas, Mirukbul, has come down after receiving enlightenment. So there are a number of mountains across Korea with the same name. But here in Tongyeong, this particular mountain has 3 exquisite temples located on its face. And it's just a wonderful and breathtaking hiking experience. But if you don't like hiking, don't worry. You could actually go up to the peak without having to exert yourself. And that's because they have a cable car. And it's actually the longest cable car in Korea, measuring almost 2 kilometers in length from the shore all the way up to the top. And this is the Hayo Waterway Observation Cable Car. And it's actually one of the most beautiful sightseeing excursions you can have. And I think one of the reasons why it's so special is because each gondola, as it goes up from the base to the peak, only has a capacity of 8 people. So a lot of times when you go in a gondola, they just jam-pack people in there because everyone wants to go. But this one is a very small gondola, so you can go up there and not have to worry about being overcrowded. You can take lots of pictures, lots of video on the way up there. And when you get up to the top, you can see the temples. You can see a lot of different historical sites. And of course, you can see the Hansan Daecheop, which is where the spirit of Admiral Lee Sun-shi has been enshrined to show his love for the country. It's probably just going to blow your mind away with how breathtaking it is. And the cable car runs year-round from 9:30 in the morning till around sunset. Now, the closing time varies from time to time based on when the actual sun sets throughout the year, but it's really well worth it. Now, there's also another place to go see a sunset in the Tongyeong area, and this is the Dal-al Park. Now, this has, one of the most varied views in all of Korea. And it's located along the Sanyang Ring Road. And it's a short 5-minute walk up from the parking lot. And from there, you can see several of the small islands around Tongyeong. And as the sun dips below the horizon, it casts great shadows on these small islands, and you're able to take some amazing photos. So if you're not on top of the mountains around Tongyeong for sunset, you can actually go here and have a great series of pictures. So that's all I have today. I'll be back tomorrow with a little bit more. Yes, Friday. Another work week has come to a close, and that means our discussion on Tongyeong is also coming to a close. And as I find with so many other places around Korea, there's just so much to see and do in these cities throughout the nation that I can never fit enough in. So today we're going to talk about one, maybe 2 places in Tongyeong that I think are very special. And the first one we're going to talk about is, of course, Lighthouse Island. And this is located on one of the smaller islands around Tongyeong. And it's actually, the name of the island is called Somemuldo, and this is one of the most beautiful jewels in all of the National Marine Park that's down there. Now, it's a small islet on the southeast portion of Tongyeong Port, and it's home to about 50 full-time residents. And it's actually consisting of, I would say, 3 different islets that the marine park is, and that's Domemuldo, Somemuldo, and of course Lighthouse Island, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And the reason why this area is so picturesque is that there is a stark beauty between the water and the cliffs that rise out from the sea, especially between Somemuldo and Lighthouse Island. And it's probably one of the best examples of Tongyeong's beautiful natural landscape and natural beauty. Now, there's an endless array of rock formations along the western part of the island, and the southern coast offers visitors an unobstructed panoramic view of the South Sea. The wind and waves have shaped the rock formations into patterns kind of suggesting a soaring dragon or a magnificent Buddha. And it's really, really beautiful. And of course, you have this just huge slab of granite rock face making the lighthouse formation. Now, during low tide, it is said that you can experience, I guess they say, the miracle of Moses, the parting of the Red Sea. So there is a portion of the area between Solmemuldo and Lighthouse Island where during low tide, the water sweeps back far enough that you can actually walk on foot across the ocean to the other island and back. Now, I've done this before, and it is a lot of fun. It's really interesting to see how the tidal energies come into play and watch the actual road form. It's really, really beautiful. They also say that in this area, during typhoons, large boulders move with the different currents and they crash together, making a thunderous roar and shaking as if an earthquake was taking place. Even though there's not. So the rocks roll around underneath and bang against the shoreline of the island, just shaking everything. It's really, really interesting. Not sure I'd want to be out in a typhoon experiencing that, but it would be a memorable experience. Now, one last thing to do in Tongyeong if you're there overnight, and that is, of course, to take a look at the canal. Now, this is a very old structure. It measures about 1,400 meters long and about 55 meters wide. And what they've done is actually undergone a beautification project, and they've outlined everything with beautiful lights. So it's a very picturesque place to walk in the evening time because of the different neon lights, the different lights that illuminate the bridge itself, and along the shoreline. So if you're looking for a very romantic place to go with your loved one, you can do that as well. So highly recommend going for a stroll along the canal at night, taking some pictures. They will make your memory last longer. Well, that's all the time I have today, all the time I have for this week. Enjoy your weekend, and I will be back next week. Ladies and gentlemen, that will just about do it for this week's podcast. Thank you so much for joining me this week. If you liked it, please subscribe to the podcast via iTunes or the RSS feed. And if you are an iTunes user, please pop on over there to rate and comment about the podcast. It's a way for the podcast to grow and get featured. If you know of someone who's interested in East Asian news or traveling around Korea or just travel in generated, please share with your friends if you think they might find it helpful. If you have any feedback, please be sure to drop me a line at podcast@QiRanger.com. But until next time, remember to be true to yourself and always be awesome. The QiRanger Podcast is written and produced by Steve Miller and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license. Morning Blue is written and performed by Josh Woodward.